The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Tuesdays are supposed to be nothing days. Not Mondays when the week turns ugly, not Fridays when you're already checked out. Just ordinary, forgettable Tuesdays. But this one I'll remember for the rest of my life, because it was the day I found out I had 30 days to vacate the house I'd been renting for 2 years in Spokane, Washington. 30 days. I stood on the front porch in my work boots with the letter in one hand and a half-eaten granola bar in the other, reading the same paragraph over and over, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They didn't. My name is Liam Hoover, and until 8 months before that Tuesday, I had what most people would call a decent life. I was 28 years old, working as a line supervisor at a food distribution warehouse on the east side of Spokane. It wasn't the kind of job you brag about at parties, but it paid $22 an hour, offered health insurance, and gave me enough stability to rent a small 2-bedroom house on a quiet street in the East Central neighborhood. I had a used truck that ran reliably, a dog named Scout who was half beagle and half something nobody could figure out, and a routine that felt solid under my feet. Then in March, the company announced it was consolidating operations and moving distribution to a facility in Portland. They offered relocation packages to about a third of the workforce. I wasn't in that third. On my last day, my supervisor shook my hand and told me I was one of the best he'd ever managed. I drove home and sat in the driveway for 40 minutes before I could go inside. I want to ask you something before I go further. If this story is reaching you at a moment when you feel like the ground is shifting under your feet, please take a second right now to like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this one exist because people like you help them travel. And sometimes, the right story finds you at exactly the right time. Back to that driveway, I had about $4,000 in savings, which sounds like something until you start doing math. Rent was $1,100 a month. Scout toss it as monthly flea medication. My truck payment was $280. Groceries, utilities, phone. It adds up faster than you ever believe it will when you're employed and not thinking about it. I told myself I'd find something within a month. Maybe 6 weeks, worst case. Worst case turned out to be much worse. I applied everywhere. Amazon fulfillment center, a lumber yard, 2 different construction companies, a grocery distribution hub just outside the city. I got callbacks. I went to interviews. I wore the collared shirt I'd bought specifically for job interviews, the dark blue one that my mom said made me look trustworthy. Some interviews went well enough that I left feeling genuinely hopeful. Then days would pass, a week, and eventually the email would come with its careful impersonal language about other candidates and how they'd keep my application on file. By month 3, I was doing gig work. DoorDash mostly, sometimes Instacart. On good weeks, I could pull in $600 or $700. On slow weeks, less than 4. It wasn't enough, and I knew it wasn't enough, but I kept telling myself it was a bridge. Just a bridge until something real came through. The rent started slipping in the 5th month. I paid partial, then made it up the following month, then fell behind again. My landlord, a man I'd only ever interacted with over email and the occasional text message, had been patient, or at least quiet about it. The certified letter was his patience running out. I read it 3 times standing on that porch. Then I folded it carefully, put it in the kitchen drawer where I kept important documents, and called my older brother in Boise. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail that I tried to keep calm and probably didn't succeed at. Then I sat on the kitchen floor with Scout curled up against my leg and stared at the refrigerator for a while. 30 days. If you've never received an eviction notice, it's hard to explain what it does to you psychologically. It's not just the practical crisis of finding somewhere to go. It's the way it reframes everything. Every choice you made, every month you let slip, every interview that didn't work out. Suddenly it all reads as a verdict, like the universe has weighed your efforts and found them insufficient. The shame was the heaviest part. I grew up in a household where you handled your business. My father worked 2 jobs for years to keep us in the same house, same school district, through some genuinely lean times. He never talked about money problems in front of us kids, but looking back, I understand there were stretches when things were very tight. He just didn't let it show. So asking for help felt like a betrayal of something I'd been taught without being taught. This idea that you figure it out. You don't burden other people, you manage. I didn't call my parents. I told myself it was because I didn't want to worry them, and there was some truth in that, but mostly it was pride, and I knew it even then. By day 8, I had started researching storage units. trying to figure out which of my things I could realistically keep somewhere versus what I'd have to sell or let go. Scout was the piece I couldn't solve. My brother's apartment in Boise had a no-pet policy. My one friend who had a house was already sleeping on the couch of his own rental, while his girlfriend's sister was staying in the spare room. There was no obvious next step, and that absence of a next step was starting to feel like a wall. I was at the kitchen table that afternoon with my laptop open to a Craigslist search for short-term rentals when I heard a knock at the door. It was the kind of knock that doesn't demand anything. 3 soft taps, like an apology. I opened the door to find a woman I didn't immediately recognize. She was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses pushed up on top of her head and the kind of expression that was hard to read. Not unfriendly, but careful. She introduced herself as Beverly Crane. She said she lived 2 houses down, the gray one with the blue shutters, had for 11 years. I probably looked confused, because she smiled slightly and said she hoped she wasn't interrupting. I told her she wasn't. She asked if I had a few minutes. Something in the way she said it made me step back from the door. Beverly came inside and looked around the room the way people do when they're trying to understand a situation without asking about it directly. She noticed the half-packed box of books near the bookshelf. She noticed the stack of mail I'd been avoiding on the counter. She didn't comment on any of it. She sat down at the kitchen table across from me and set her hands flat on the surface. Then she said she was going to say something, and she hoped I'd let her finish before responding. She told me she knew about the certified letter. I felt my face go tight. I asked how. She said she hadn't been snooping. She'd been walking past one morning about a week earlier when the mail carrier was leaving, and she'd seen the orange certified mail slip on my door. She knew what those usually meant in this neighborhood, because she'd seen it happen to 3 other tenants over the years on this street, and she said that for the past week, she'd been trying to decide whether to say something or mind her own business, and she'd decided she couldn't just watch. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't had a real conversation with Beverly Crane before that afternoon. We'd waved from driveways. Once she'd knocked to ask if I'd seen a tabby cat she was watching for her daughter. That was the full extent of it. She asked me what happened. I don't know why I told her. Maybe because she'd walked over here and knocked on a stranger's door, which took more nerve than most people would bother with. And something about that unlocked something in me. I told her about the warehouse job, about the consolidation, about the months of gig work and shrinking savings, and the job interviews that kept not working out. I told her about the storage unit research, and the Scout problem, and the wall I kept hitting when I tried to imagine what came next. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Scout had come in and was sitting beside Beverly's chair, looking up at her with the shameless optimism that only dogs are capable of. Beverly reached down and scratched behind his ear. Then she looked at me and said she wanted to tell me something about herself. Before she retired 4 years ago, Beverly Crane had spent 26 years working in workforce development, first for the state of Washington, then for a nonprofit called Cascade Employment Partners, that worked specifically with people who had experienced sudden job displacement, layoffs, facility closures, industry collapse. She'd helped hundreds of people navigate exactly the kind of hole I was in. She'd retired early because of her husband's illness. He had passed away 14 months ago. She said she missed working. Not because she needed something to do, she had plenty, but because that kind of work had given her a specific feeling of usefulness that was hard to replace. And she'd been thinking since her husband died about whether there was a way to do something again, smaller scale, more personal. Then she told me what she was proposing. She had a finished basement apartment in her house. She'd rented it out years ago and had kept it empty since her husband got sick because managing a tenant during that time was more than she could handle. It had a separate entrance, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom. It had been sitting unused for 2.5 years. She said she would let me stay there for 3 months, no rent. In exchange, she wanted me to commit to what she called a real job search, not just applications, but a structured, strategic approach that she would help me with. Resume overhaul, interview coaching, industry targeting, networking outreach. The kind of support that workforce development programs offered, but that most people never accessed because they didn't know it existed or didn't know how to find it. She said she wasn't doing this out of pity. She was doing it because she had skills she hadn't used in 4 years and a space she wasn't using, and a neighbor who looked like he was running out of road. I sat there for a long moment. I think I said something like, "Why me? Why a stranger? Beverly picked up her glasses from the top of her head and set them on the table. She said that when she was 31 years old and had just moved to Spokane for a job that fell through 2 weeks after she arrived. A woman she barely knew had let her sleep on a pull-out sofa for 6 weeks and helped her find her footing. She said she'd spent a long time wondering how to pay that forward, and she'd learned over the years that the answer was usually just to do it when you saw the sustament. I moved into the basement apartment 4 days later with Scout and 2 carloads of things that mattered. The first morning I woke up there, I lay on the mattress Beverly had set up and stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't felt in months, which was a specific kind of quiet. Not the anxious quiet of my old kitchen at 2 in the morning, a different kind. Something that had more room in it. Beverly was not gentle with the job search. I want to be clear about that. She was kind, but she was not soft. The first she did was sit down with me for 3 hours and go through my resume line by line. She asked me to explain every bullet point. When my explanations were stronger than what was written, she'd say, "Why isn't that in here?" She helped me reframe my experience in the warehouse not as basic labor supervision, but as logistics coordination and team management with measurable outcomes. She made me dig up actual numbers, how many people I'd supervised, what our error rate had been, how we'd handled a particular supply shortage during the pandemic. Numbers I'd never thought to include because nobody had ever told me they mattered. She also told me to stop applying to everything. She said the scattershot approach was efficient at producing rejection and not much else. We made a list of target industries that matched my actual skills. Third-party logistics companies, cold chain distribution, regional grocery chains with their own distribution infrastructure, companies that would value what I actually knew. She coached me on interviews in a way nobody ever had. We'd sit at her kitchen table and she'd ask me questions and then stop me mid-answer and say, "You're burying the lead. Start with the result. Then explain how you got there." She recorded one of our practice sessions on her phone and made me watch it back, which was genuinely painful, but the version of myself I saw in the video 2 weeks later was noticeably different from the first one. There were hard days. Days when the applications felt like shouting into nothing, when the silence from employers felt personal even though I knew it wasn't. One afternoon I got a rejection from a company I genuinely believed I had a real shot at, and I sat in the basement for a couple hours not really doing much of anything. Beverly came down around 6 that evening with a pot of chicken soup. She set it on the counter and said she wasn't going to tell me it was fine, because it wasn't fine and she knew it. She said the rejection was real and it made sense to feel it. Then she said we'd look at 2 new companies in the morning. That was what she did. She didn't minimize and she didn't dramatize. She just kept moving forward and expected me to keep moving with her. About 5 weeks in, she asked me to come upstairs one evening. She said she wanted to show me something. On her kitchen table, she had spread out a small business plan, or the beginning of one. She'd been putting it together quietly over the past few weeks while we'd been working on my job search. It was a plan for something she was calling the East Spokane Resource Collective, a small community-based workforce support organization that would operate out of a donated space she'd been in conversation with a local church about. Not a big nonprofit, small, targeted, focused specifically on people who had experienced sudden job displacement in the Spokane area. Resume help, interview coaching, connections to employers who had committed to considering candidates from the program. She'd already had preliminary conversations with 4 local employers. She showed me the plan, and then she looked at me across the table and said she could use a coordinator. Someone who understood the experience of the people who would walk through the door. Someone who could help run intake, do basic resume coaching under her supervision, and be the first face that people saw when they came in scared and didn't know what to do next. The position wouldn't pay much to start, barely above minimum wage, honestly, but it would be real work, full-time, and it would grow. I asked her why she was telling me this now, before I'd found anything else. She said she was telling me because whether I took the coordinator role or not, knowing the organization existed might change how I thought about my own search, that I might find it useful to think of my next job not just as income but as a direction. I didn't take the coordinator position right away. I want to be honest about that. I was still looking for something that would get me back to where I'd been financially, and I wasn't sure a nonprofit startup was the way there, but something shifted in how I thought about the job search after that conversation. I started looking not just for jobs, but for roles where the work itself meant something. That shift was subtle, but it changed what I applied for and how I talked about myself in interviews. 3 weeks later, I had a conversation that changed everything. One of the employers Beverly had connected with for the Resource Collective was a regional logistics company called Summit Freight, headquartered in Spokane with operations across the Pacific Northwest. The owner, a man named Robert Fitch, had agreed to be an employer partner for the new organization, which meant committing to interview candidates who came through the program. Beverly introduced me to Robert not as a job candidate, but as the person helping her build the program. We met him at a coffee shop on Sprague Avenue, and the three of us talked for an hour about workforce gaps in the region, about what made someone a good logistics supervisor, about what it actually took to manage a crew of people during high-pressure supply windows. At some point, Robert asked me directly about my experience at the warehouse. I told him. I used the language Beverly had helped me develop: real numbers, specific situations, concrete outcomes. He asked follow-up questions that told me he was actually listening. 2 days after that coffee meeting, Robert's operations director called and asked if I could come in for a formal interview. I wore the blue shirt. I walked out with a job offer. Full-time, salaried, benefits, $1.50 more per hour than I'd been making at the warehouse. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of Summit Freight's office and looked at the offer letter for a long time. Not because I couldn't believe it, but because I needed a moment to feel the full weight of where I'd been and where I was now. I moved out of Beverly's basement apartment on a Saturday morning in late spring. The dogwood tree in her backyard had just come into bloom, and Scout kept sniffing around the base of it while I loaded boxes into my truck. Beverly stood on the back steps with a coffee mug in both hands, watching. When I was done loading, I walked back to the steps. I didn't have the right words, and I knew it, so I didn't try to have the right words. I just told her that I didn't know how to explain what those 3 months had meant. She said she thought I probably did know, actually. She just smiled and said, "Go be good at it. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you've made it to this part of the story, it means something in it connected with you. Please take a moment right now to leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, and tell me about one person who showed up for you when you weren't expecting it. Your story matters, and someone watching today might need to hear it." I started at Summit Freight that Monday. The work was familiar in the bones of it, but the scale was larger and the systems were more complex, and I loved the challenge of it. I was good at it in a way that felt earned rather than accidental, and I did say yes to Beverly's coordinator offer. Just not right away. 3 months after I started at Summit Freight, Beverly called and said the Resource Collective had secured its first full grant from a regional foundation and was ready to bring on paid staff. She asked if I'd consider a part-time role, evenings and weekends, to help get intake off the ground while she worked on building out the full team. I said yes before she finished the sentence. The people who came through that door in the early months, I recognized all of them. Not their faces, but the particular posture of someone who is holding themselves together with effort and is scared that anyone can tell. The slightly too formal clothes for a casual intake meeting. The over-prepared folder of documents. The way they'd laugh nervously at nothing in particular, and then stop, like they'd remembered they weren't supposed to be having a good time. I recognized all of it because I'd been that person, and Beverly was right. That recognition was worth more than any credential. In the 2 years since the Resource Collective opened its doors, it has helped just over 300 people in the Spokane area navigate job displacement and find stable employment. I know that number because I've been part of tracking it. I know what it represents. 300 people who got to feel the specific relief of a real job offer after a season of not knowing. 300 times that parking lot moment with the offer letter and the truck and the sitting very still. Beverly Crane is still running the organization. She has a small staff now, a real office space, and a wait list for her employer partner program. She also started a monthly support group for recent widows and widowers in the neighborhood, which has nothing to do with workforce development and everything to do with the kind of person she is. Scout is 9 now. His muzzle has gone gray in the last year, but he still has the same shameless optimism about strangers. Every time Beverly comes over to our apartment, I moved to a place across town with my girlfriend last year. He acts like she just returned from a very long trip. Maybe in some sense she did. I think about that certified letter sometimes. The way it felt in my hands on that Tuesday porch. I've thought about what would have happened if Beverly Crane had decided it wasn't her business. If she'd walked past my door that morning and looked the other way and told herself, someone else will help him. I don't say that to make her into something larger than she is. Beverly would be the first person to push back on any version of this story that turned her into a saint. She'd say she had a basement apartment she wasn't using and skills she wanted to put back to work, and I happened to be standing at the end of her street looking like I needed both. She'd say it was practical, but I've been in that basement. I've sat with the people who came through that intake door. I know what it means to have one person decide that you are worth the trouble of showing up for, when they had every reason not to. It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't erase the hard months, or the shame or the nights I sat on the kitchen floor. But it changes what those things mean. It turns them from evidence of failure into the beginning of a story that isn't finished yet. If this story found you today, I hope it gave you something you can hold on to. Please like the video, share it with someone who might be carrying something heavy right now, and subscribe to Mercy Stories for more, because I have to believe, that there are more Beverly Cranes out there than we think, and sometimes the only thing standing between someone and that knock at the door is the decision to walk down the street and knock.